Excellence.
In Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré became the first person to receive his new AES passport. This event comes just days after celebrations in Burkina Faso and Niger, marking the official exit of the three countries from the West African Economic and Monetary Union.
What happens when Africa issues its own passport and the world rushes to say it's rejected? The AES Passport, launched by Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, was mocked online as fake and denied. Yet proof shows the opposite. It's fully recognized by the International Civil Aviation Organization, accepted by the EU after system updates, and confirmed by China as valid. As the official statement reads, China does not need Western approval to validate the passport of a country or confederation. What was meant to be Africa's embarrassment has become its boldest symbol of sovereignty. But who really rejected it, and who was the first one to accept? Let's find out. When the Alliance of Sahel States AES, comprising Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, unveiled their joint passport on February 2, 2025, it was intended to be a moment of triumph. The rollout in Ouagadougou, attended by government officials and captured by international media, showed the first citizens proudly receiving their new passports. The initiative was part of a larger project by the three countries to consolidate sovereignty after formally leaving ECOWAS in 2024. For them, the AES passport was more than an administrative tool. It was a declaration to the world: we are building institutions on our own terms. But almost immediately, the launch collided with a storm of narratives that threatened to overshadow the moment. Within hours, social media platforms lit up with claims that the AES passport was already useless. The most viral posts alleged that France had rejected it outright, that the European Union refused to issue visas, and even that China had denied recognition. These claims came packaged in dramatic language and slickly edited videos, designed for virality. One post that circulated widely on TikTok declared, "This is the shortest-lived passport in history." For ordinary citizens scrolling through their feeds, the situation was confusing. How could a passport that had just been issued already be invalid abroad? How could leaders unveil it in front of cameras if it had not passed international checks? The contradictory nature of the rumors was almost secondary. What mattered was the speed with which they spread. This was the first sign that the AES passport was not just a travel document. It had become a battlefield for legitimacy. The global press was quick to pick up on the controversy. Headlines in Western outlets framed the story around questions over recognition, even before official clarifications were made. In effect, the framing amplified the confusion. Rather than celebrating a new African integration milestone, the story became about whether the rest of the world would accept Africa's sovereignty project. By the time Africa News and regional broadcasters published footage of the official launch, the misinformation had already set the tone of the debate. This was not the first time that Africa's steps toward autonomy had been undermined by narrative warfare. In fact, observers of the region noted the striking similarity between the AES passport controversy and earlier disinformation campaigns surrounding Sahelian policies, such as Mali's withdrawal from French-led military missions or Burkina Faso's decision to nationalize parts of its gold sector. In each case, critics quickly deployed scare stories suggesting isolation, rejection, or collapse. The AES passport fit the same pattern. A sovereignty move immediately met with attempts to delegitimize it. Inside the AES, however, the governments were ready. Officials released clear statements emphasizing that the passport had been designed in compliance with the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO standards. That meant it was technically valid from the start, regardless of political opinions. By anchoring the passport in an international regulatory framework, the AES leaders had safeguarded it against arbitrary rejection. What the rumors overlooked or deliberately ignored was that recognition of passports at the level of air travel depends on ICAO compliance, not on the whims of a single government. Even as clarifications began to surface, the speed of disinformation left a lasting impression. Analysts from Disinfo.Africa, a regional fact-checking platform, reported that coordinated accounts were amplifying the same false claims across multiple languages and platforms. They concluded that the controversy was not organic. It was being stoked deliberately to erode public trust in the AES's experiment with integration. Their report highlighted that many of the earliest viral posts originated from outside the Sahel itself, a clue that the backlash was strategically engineered. For African citizens watching the story unfold, the breaking news was not simply about a passport launch. It was about how quickly Africa's assertion of independence triggers a reaction from systems invested in maintaining control. The AES Passport, by its very existence, unsettled the hierarchies of validation that have long governed African mobility. Who decides whether an African passport is legitimate, Africans themselves or outsiders? The confusion following its unveiling made clear that the answer to this question is contested. What was meant to be a straightforward announcement of a new document became an international drama exposing the fragile balance between sovereignty and perception. The AES had set out to create a symbol of unity and independence, and instead it found itself forced to defend its credibility on the global stage within hours of the launch. This paradox, between the reality of recognition and the narrative of rejection, is what makes the AES Passport more than an administrative story. It is a test case for whether Africa can control the narrative around its own future. The storm that surrounded the unveiling of the AES Passport revealed more than a battle over facts. It exposed how a simple document can evolve into a weapon of identity. In international politics, a passport is not just a ticket across borders. It is the physical manifestation of a state's existence, proof that its citizens belong to a recognized political order. For Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, countries that have spent the last 3 years challenging the dominance of former colonial powers, the act of issuing a collective passport was deliberately symbolic. It was their way of declaring to the world, we are not fragments to be managed by outsiders. We are a union with the authority to define who we are. The timing of the AES Passport's debut matters. All 3 member states had recently severed ties with ECOWAS, the regional bloc they accused of being manipulated by Paris and Brussels. By withdrawing, they forfeited the privileges of ECOWAS travel documents, which allowed relatively free movement across West Africa. Critics predicted this would isolate their citizens, leaving them at the mercy of foreign consulates. Instead of retreating, however, the AES leadership doubled down and produced a replacement passport of their own, asserting that integration would not be dictated from outside, but rebuilt from within. As People's Dispatch explained, the event brought together leaders and citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in a show of unity and pride, an affirmation of their commitment to sovereignty and regional collaboration. This was a radical departure from the script Africa has been forced to follow for decades. Since the colonial period, most African identity documents have been shaped and validated by external models. Their designs, biometric systems, and even printing facilities were often outsourced to Europe, reinforcing the idea that legitimacy had to come from outside. The AES Passport challenged that dependency directly. With its deep blue cover and the AES insignia embossed in gold, it was an unmistakable statement. The Sahel can produce its own instruments of mobility without borrowing anyone else's stamp of approval. That defiance is precisely why misinformation surged so violently after its release. To critics invested in maintaining Western dominance, the passport was more than paper. It was an act of rebellion. Allowing it to succeed without challenge would mean acknowledging that African sovereignty projects can stand independently. Instead, a narrative had to be manufactured to convince people it was stillborn. The question then becomes, why are Africans told so often that their own creations are invalid unless outsiders approve them? The AES Passport strikes at the heart of that question by existing as an undeniable fact. It is important, too, to see how ordinary citizens responded. In Niamey and Bamako, people lined up to inquire about applications, even while the rumors of rejection were swirling online. Their interest was not driven by convenience. Many already had older ECOWAS documents still valid, but by pride. Carrying the AES passport meant carrying proof that their governments were no longer under the thumb of foreign institutions. The fact that people still pursued it despite the disinformation shows the emotional power of sovereignty symbols. Identity documents, after all, are not just practical items. They are badges of belonging. International law reinforces this perspective. Under the framework of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, recognition of passports is tied to statehood and membership in bodies like the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. Because Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are UN member states and ICAO participants, their joint passport carries inherent legitimacy. This is what makes the misinformation so telling. Those who spread it hope to create a psychological rejection where no legal rejection existed. In other words, it was an attempt to erode confidence in sovereignty by manufacturing doubt. The AES leadership understood this danger, which is why their speeches at the launch did not focus on technicalities but on dignity. Leaders described the passport as a shield of independence, a phrase chosen carefully to frame it not just as a travel tool, but as a protective symbol. By embedding sovereignty into a physical object carried by every citizen, the AES gave its people a daily reminder of their autonomy. This is what made the launch such a direct challenge to the old order. It democratized sovereignty, placing it not in government offices or treaties, but in the pockets of farmers, students, and traders. In the end, the controversy revealed a deeper truth. The AES passport is not simply a bureaucratic invention. It is a political weapon wrapped in leather and ink. It forces the world to confront a question it has long avoided. Can African nations define their own legitimacy, or must they always borrow it? By issuing this passport, the Sahel states answered with a resounding yes. The next challenge, however, would be whether foreign governments, particularly in Europe, would move beyond misinformation and adjust their systems to accommodate this new document. And that is where the story leads next. Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. If the AES passport was born as a bold statement of sovereignty, the first real test came not in Bamako or Ouagadougou, but in Europe's consulates and border posts. For decades, African mobility to Europe has been entangled in a web of suspicion, bureaucracy, and hierarchy. When the AES states rolled out their joint passport, it collided head-on with this reality. Europe's handling of the situation revealed less about legality and more about its reflexive unease whenever Africa takes independent action. Early applicants who carried the new passport into European consulates did not face outright refusal, but instead found themselves in a limbo of paperwork. Appointment systems had not yet been updated to recognize the document's coding. Border management databases, which are tied into the Schengen Information System, still list the former ECOWAS templates. As a result, clerks had to manually override the system or place applications on hold. For ordinary travelers, these technical hiccups looked like rejection. For critics online, it was easy fuel to claim Europe had refused the passport. But behind these surface glitches lay a deeper issue: Europe's history of controlling African mobility. The Schengen framework was designed with centralized vetting, where any change in documentation requires collective approval among member states. That process is slow even for European partners, let alone for African states that are not part of EU structures. The AES passport, therefore, entered a labyrinth where every administrative delay could be interpreted as political resistance. In truth, European embassies never issued a formal policy of rejection. Yet their silence in the early days of confusion allowed the misinformation wave to spread unchecked. The episode highlights a long-standing asymmetry. When Europe updates its own documents, other regions adapt without question. When Africa does the same, it is greeted with suspicion and delay. This imbalance reinforced the AES leaders' argument that African sovereignty is judged by different standards. Even as ICAO recognition made the passport technically valid, Europe's sluggish adjustment to its systems suggested a reluctance to treat African initiatives with urgency. Was it mere bureaucracy, or was politics shaping the pace of recognition? Observers noted the difference between Western European states and others in the EU countries with deep colonial ties to the Sahel, particularly France, were the lowest to issue clarifications. Meanwhile, states with less direct history in the region, like Hungary or Poland, quietly began accepting the new document, once their databases were updated. This uneven response hinted at something larger. Europe's discomfort was not uniform, but tied to historical baggage. The AES Passport forced former colonial powers to acknowledge that their ex-colonies were now acting as equals, not subordinates. Another layer complicating Europe's reaction was the security discourse. For years, the Sahel has been portrayed in European media as a hub of instability, insurgency, migration, and coups. Against that backdrop, the sudden arrival of a new joint passport triggered anxieties about irregular migration. Policy analysts in Brussels openly speculated that the AES might use its passport to facilitate freer movement of migrants into Europe. Although baseless, these fears played into the narrative of delay, reinforcing hesitation in updating systems. In this sense, the passport was not judged on its technical merits, but on the political symbolism Europe attached to it. Eventually, clarifications did emerge. By mid-February, European Union consulates began confirming that AES passports could indeed be used for visa applications once their systems were updated. Several travelers posted photos online of Schengen visas affixed to the new document, proof that the rumors of rejection had been false. But the damage had already been done. Misinformation had circulated for weeks, shaping public perception more powerfully than any embassy statement could undo. The European reaction, then, revealed two things at once. On the surface, the delays were bureaucratic, a matter of software and databases catching up with reality. But underneath, they exposed a deeper hesitation to embrace African sovereignty when it arrives outside of European frameworks. The AES passport made Europe confront an uncomfortable fact. Africans were building integration on their own terms, and Europe could not control the timeline. This uneasy adjustment set the stage for the next chapter of the story. If Europe struggled to move past hesitation, another global power moved with clarity. China's response was swift, unambiguous, and revealing of a very different relationship with African sovereignty. That contrast would speak volumes about the changing balance of power in global diplomacy. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If Europe's handling of the AES passport was marked by hesitation and bureaucracy, China's response unfolded in a strikingly different register. Where Europe allowed confusion to fester, Beijing delivered a clear and immediate message. The AES passport was recognized, valid, and welcomed. This contrast was not accidental. It reflected two different philosophies of dealing with Africa. One still carries the weight of colonial history. The other seeks to frame itself as a partner in a multipolar world where African sovereignty is no longer negotiable. Chinese embassies in Bamako, Niamey, and Ouagadougou issued statements within days of the launch, confirming that the AES passport would be accepted for visa applications without disruption. The Chinese Foreign Ministry reinforced this stance at a press conference in Beijing, where a spokesperson dismissed the viral claims of rejection as baseless rumors. For travelers and observers alike, the message was clear. Unlike Europe, which stumbled through administrative limbo, China treated the AES passport as a straightforward legal document backed by international aviation standards. This swiftness carried symbolic weight. It was more than a matter of consular procedure. It was a gesture of respect. By responding quickly and firmly, Beijing positioned itself as a partner that recognizes Africa's right to define its own institutions without waiting for external blessing. For the AES states, this was exactly the type of international validation they sought. Not a reluctant adjustment after weeks of speculation, but an affirmation that their sovereignty was legitimate from day one. China's decision must be understood in the context of its broader Africa policy. For the past 2 decades, Beijing has built its influence on the continent, not by lecturing governments, but by engaging in infrastructure projects, trade agreements, and development partnerships. From railways in East Africa to energy plants in West Africa, China has projected itself as a builder rather than a tutor. Recognition of the AES passport fits seamlessly into this pattern. It required no ideological debates, only respect for Africa's decision to act as a collective bloc. The move also had a strategic dimension. At a time when the West's influence in the Sahel is shrinking, Particularly after France's military withdrawals, China's prompt recognition signaled its readiness to fill the vacuum. For Beijing, supporting African sovereignty is not just diplomatic courtesy, it is an investment in a long-term partnership. By treating the AES passport as valid without hesitation, China strengthened its credibility as a power willing to align with Africa's independence rather than undermine it. Reactions from Sahelian citizens underscored this dynamic. Social media posts from AES nationals applying for Chinese visas showed relief that Beijing had not wavered amid the confusion. For many, this reinforced the perception that China is a partner that respects African decisions in practice, not just in speeches. In an environment where European clarifications were slow and mistrustful, Beijing's clarity stood out. Another layer of importance lies in the diplomatic theater. By addressing the rumors so publicly, China exposed how disinformation can be weaponized against Africa's sovereignty projects. Instead of ignoring the chatter, Chinese officials actively refuted it, turning the tables on those spreading misinformation. This approach not only reassured AES citizens, but also undermined the credibility of rumor networks that had sought to delegitimize the passport from the start. Critics in the West interpreted China's move differently. Analysts in European think tanks suggested that Beijing's quick recognition was a strategic maneuver to deepen its influence in a region where Western power is collapsing. While this critique may hold some truth, it misses the core point. Whatever China's strategic calculations, the fact remains that African sovereignty benefited directly from Beijing's recognition. For the AES, it was less about motives and more about outcomes, practical confirmation that their document worked abroad. The contrast between Europe and China, therefore, became a story in itself. Where one hesitated and left room for others to thrive, the other acted decisively and eliminated confusion. This divergence was not just procedural, it revealed two competing ways of relating to Africa in the 21st century. One still filtered through colonial legacies and suspicion, the other shaped by pragmatic partnership and respect for independence. The AES passport, intended as a symbol of unity, had inadvertently become a litmus test of global attitudes toward African sovereignty. Europe's hesitation and China's swiftness offered Africans a glimpse of who was prepared to accept them on equal terms. But the controversy also raised a larger question. Why was misinformation so potent in the first place? Why did false claims of rejection gain more traction than official clarifications? The answer lies in the deliberate use of disinformation as a weapon against African independence, an issue that would define the next stage of the passport story. By the time both Europe and China had clarified their positions on the AES passport, another truth had already emerged. The greatest battle was never fought at airports or consulates, but in the arena of information warfare. The flood of false claims that erupted within hours of the passport's launch was not accidental. It was coordinated, timed, and deliberately designed to chip away at the most fragile part of any sovereignty project: public trust. Investigators at Disinfo.Africa traced dozens of the earliest viral posts back to networks that had been active during previous campaigns aimed at delegitimizing Sahelian governments. Their analysis showed a familiar pattern: accounts posting in multiple languages simultaneously, amplifying each other's content, and pushing a single narrative of failure. In one case, a video falsely claiming that French border police had confiscated an AES passport was shared across 5 platforms within 20 minutes, reaching hundreds of thousands before fact-checkers could intervene. These were not random mistakes. They were coordinated attempts to undermine the AES initiative before it could gain momentum. The choice of target was clever. Unlike policy papers or military maneuvers, a passport is a tangible object carried by ordinary citizens. Casting doubt on it meant casting doubt on the very identity of the people it represented. If Africans could be convinced that their own document was worthless, the psychological blow would be immense. This is why the disinformation framed the passport as rejected and useless, rather than focusing on technical details. The goal was not to debate legality, but to cause humiliation. What makes the story significant is how Africa responded. Instead of collapsing under the weight of rumor, the AES governments and regional media launched a counteroffensive. National broadcasters in Burkina Faso aired footage of citizens receiving their passports, holding them up proudly for the cameras. Africa News ran segments explaining the passport's compliance with International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO standards. On social media, local influencers began sharing photos of themselves applying for visas with the new document, directly challenging the viral falsehoods. In effect, Africa turned the weapon of narrative back on itself. This resilience reflected a broader shift in how African societies are learning to deal with disinformation. In the past, rumors about state initiatives often lingered unchallenged, eroding confidence silently. But in the case of the AES Passport, there was a coordinated effort to fact-check in real time, not only by independent platforms like Disinfo Africa, but also by governments willing to communicate quickly and directly. The strategy was simple but effective. Meet disinformation not with silence, but with images, testimonies, and clarifications that ordinary people could see and trust. The speed of the pushback mattered. By mid-February, photos of AES passports bearing Schengen visas and Chinese entry stamps began circulating online. These were not press releases. They were physical proof, shared by real travelers, that the passport worked. Once these images spread, the viral claims began to lose credibility. In many ways, this grassroots counter-narrative did more to defend the passport's legitimacy than official statements ever could. Sovereignty, after all, is not only recognized in institutions, it is validated in daily life when citizens use their documents without hindrance. The disinformation war also revealed something deeper about Africa's geopolitical environment. Sovereignty is not just about resources or military power, it is about controlling the storyline of legitimacy. Those who launched the campaign against the AES passport understood that undermining the symbol could weaken the larger political project of Sahelian independence. But the failure of that campaign highlighted the opposite, that Africa is now better equipped to resist narrative attacks, especially when its sovereignty projects are rooted in concrete institutions like a functioning passport. Perhaps the most important lesson of the episode is that disinformation will not disappear. It will evolve. Each step Africa takes toward independence, whether nationalizing resources, forming new alliances, or issuing collective documents, will be met with attempts to ridicule and delegitimize it. But the AES passport showed that rumors collapse in the face of reality when governments, citizens, and fact-checkers work together to expose the lies. What began as a flood of humiliating claims ended with a stronger symbol, an internationally recognized passport carried proudly by Sahelian citizens, proof that Africa's future is not decided by rumor but by resolve. And so, the story comes full circle. What was supposed to be a weapon against African sovereignty became a case study in resilience. The AES passport now stands not only as a tool of travel, but also as a shield against disinformation, reminding the world that Africa will not only write its own documents, it will write its own truth. Do you believe Africa still needs outside approval to validate its sovereignty? Let us know in the comments section. Who benefits most when misinformation about African independence spreads online? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.